The council chamber of Flaxborough, scrubbed and buffed to a brightness it rarely enjoyed outside election season, glowed under the harsh light of its chandelier. The chandelier itself had been polished to such an extent that it seemed to resent every speck of dust daring to reappear on its surface. The long oak tables bore their burden of aspic, pies, trifles, and a salmon mousse so pink it might have been painted. Glasses clinked with municipal pride as the town's elite, or what passed for it, gathered in their most ambitious evening wear. This was the gala of the year, the council's self-congratulation rendered edible. The mayor, Alderman Cowdray, stood in his robes and chain, raising his glass to speak. He had barely cleared his throat when a shriek cracked the air like a pane of glass struck by a hammer. It came from Mrs. Durdle, the town librarian, who had been admiring the silver Jubilee cup displayed on its plinth at the center of the room. Now she staggered backwards, her hands clawing at empty air. Her heel caught in the hem of her skirt, and she lurched against a table laden with trifles. The wobble was calamitous. Jelly slid, custard toppled, and the mayor's carefully rehearsed toast was obliterated by the sight everyone now beheld. Councillor Edwin Raxby lay sprawled at the foot of the plinth, his florid face slack, his tie a garish strip of scarlet clinging damply to a mound of salmon mousse. He was unmistakably dead, though in a theatrical pose as if he had chosen humiliation as his exit style. A gasp swept the hall, followed by a shattering of crockery as someone dropped their plate. For perhaps 10 seconds, silence reigned. Then Flaxborough, as ever, found its voice. The first whispers were scandal, but very quickly the room became a beehive of commentary. "Did you see his lips? Purple as a gooseberry," muttered Mr. Creek, the ironmonger who prided himself on noticing such things. "Heart gave out, mark my words. Been living too well," said Mrs. Dolap, her eyes shining with the satisfaction of having foreseen the event. "Too well indeed," countered Mr. Pike from the King's Arms, though some reckon he was dabbling with the land office, and folk who dabble there end badly. "It was the moose," hissed a church verger, leaning close to his neighbor. "I warned them about undercooked fish." "Poison, if you ask me," declared the butcher's wife, who saw conspiracy in anything that didn't involve meat. And then, as if the body alone wasn't sufficient drama, another fact emerged. "The cup!" shrieked Mrs. Durdle, recovered enough to contribute. "The Jubilee cup, it's gone!" Heads whipped round to stare at the plinth. Indeed, where moments earlier the town's pride had gleamed beneath its spotlight, there was only the impression of its absence. A faint smear of dust traced across the velvet cushion and down to the floor like the afterimage of civic virtue dragged away. Thus, in one appalling instant, Flaxborough was robbed of both a councillor and its most polished piece of silverware. The mayor spluttered, his toast abandoned, while Alderman Teal insisted in booming tones that no one leave the chamber until the police had arrived. His attempt at authority was undercut by the fact that his wig had slipped sideways in his agitation, leaving him looking less magistrate than pantomime. The crowd seethed with contradictory theories. Some whispered of a thief seizing opportunity in the confusion. Others muttered about vendettas, poisons, and secret affairs. The social order of Flaxborough, already fragile, trembled under the pressure of having too much to talk about at once. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, with Sergeant Love in tow, the gala resembled less a celebration than a marketplace of rumor. People pointed, denied, accused, and excused themselves in tones designed to be overheard. Purbright entered quietly, but his presence drew immediate attention. His calm manner contrasted so starkly with the crowd's agitation that a ripple of silence followed in his wake. He moved slowly to the body, his gaze sweeping not only over Raxby but over the discarded napkins, the scattered vol au vents, and the velvet cushion's telltale streak of dust. He knelt, inspected, then stood again, all without haste. Where others saw calamity, Purbright saw imbalance. Something had been removed, and in that absence lay the story. Sergeant Love leaned closer, lowering his voice. Looks like a seizure, sir. Perhaps he fell against the table. That moose is everywhere. Purbright's eyes twinkled briefly. One might note, Sergeant, that the counsellor has managed to provide us with two puzzles at once, his own demise and the vanishing of civic property. Whether the two are friends or strangers, we shall soon see. Love glanced toward the plinth. Stolen? At a gala like this? But who? That, Purbright replied softly, is precisely the question. The whispering had redoubled as news of the missing cup circulated. Mrs. Dewlap was already explaining, with the authority of one who had never been wrong in her own estimation, that Raxby had attempted to shield the trophy and been struck down for his loyalty. Others scoffed and countered that he was the thief himself, dropping dead in the act. A few even suggested that the cup was never there at all, a notion quickly quashed by those who had admired it earlier. Just then, Constable Trimble returned from a hasty sweep of the adjoining corridors. His face was pale, his words stammering. Inspector, the side door. It's unlocked. No sign of force. The announcement sent fresh ripples through the crowd. The implication was immediate. Anyone could have slipped in or out. Someone, perhaps, had. A woman's nervous laugh broke the silence, brittle and quickly stifled. Purbright's gaze flickered to the sound but gave away nothing. He allowed the murmur to grow, then spoke with quiet weight. We shall need to account for everyone's movements this evening, and we shall begin, I think, with those most eager to explain themselves. The chamber held its breath. Raxby's body seemed to dominate the hall, a grotesque centerpiece to civic pride that had turned to civic disgrace. The plinth, empty and accusatory, seemed to point its velvet finger at every guest in turn. And behind it all, Inspector Purbright's calm eyes took everything in, noting the eagerness of some, the reluctance of others, and the single clue no one else appeared to have noticed. For on the hem of Raxby's flamboyant tie, half hidden in salmon mousse, was a faint powdering of silver polish, the sort used for trophies. More answers in Chapter 2. But first, what's your theory? The body of Councillor Raxby had been respectfully covered with a cloth borrowed from the buffet table, though the choice of a lace-edged damask gave the impression of a theatrical performance rather than solemnity. Guests pressed themselves into anxious clusters, their whispers a susurration that grew and died as Inspector Purbright passed among them. His calm presence seemed to absorb the nervous energy, though no one felt reassured. They felt only scrutinized, which was worse. Sergeant Love, notebook at the ready, glanced uneasily at the groups forming little barricades of indignation and suspicion. Shall I start with names, sir? Best get statements before half of them invent alibis. He looked hopefully at Purbright, who inclined his head. Do that, Love, but don't only write down what they tell you. Notice what they forget to say. Love muttered an agreement, already dreading the task. He approached Alderman Teal first, whose wig now perched more firmly but whose dignity remained shaken. Teal puffed out his chest. Inspector, I insist this is nothing more than a tragic collapse. Councillor Raxby had a constitution prone to excess. Drink, rich foods, agitation. His system could not bear it. Love jotted, then asked blandly, And the missing Jubilee Cup? Teal faltered. Well, some prank, no doubt. Students, perhaps, or a tradesman with an eye for silver. Nothing more. Love marked the words down while noting how Teal avoided eye contact. Purbright, observing from a short distance, caught the tremor in the man's hand as he adjusted his wig again. Elsewhere, Mrs. Dewlap recounted her version with relish. I told my husband that Edwin would not last the year. Did I not, dear? The way he scoffed sweets like a child, it's a miracle he reached 50. But poison, pah, nature took him, and nature knows best. Her husband attempted a nod, though his mouth was full of trifle. Love dutifully recorded, though the inspector's gaze lingered longer on her satisfaction than on her words. Too much relish in predicting death, he thought, often concealed more than foresight. Mr. Creek. The ironmonger was next, insisting on conspiracy. "Mark me, Inspector, this was no accident. Raxby had enemies. He dealt sharply, too sharply. Land office, contracts, shady favors. Someone made him pay." He leaned in, lowering his voice with relish. "And don't forget the cup. Why steal it unless it mattered to him?" "Did it matter?" asked Purbright gently. Creek blinked. "Well, it must have. Mustn't it?" The ironmonger's bluster thinned at the inspector's steady gaze. Purbright merely thanked him and moved on. The verger, still in his cassock, though sweat-dampened now, declared in sepulchral tones, "It is retribution." Councillor Raxby defied the Lord's house, arguing for late licenses and more public entertainments. "Temptations, Inspector, temptations." He was struck down, just as the Israelites were struck for their grumblings. Love scribbled half a line, then abandoned the rest. Purbright inclined his head politely, though inwardly he marked the verger as another whose zeal might be more useful for distraction than for truth. As the statements grew, so did the contradictions. To some, Raxby had been jovial and generous, a patron of small charities. To others, he was arrogant, conniving, and slippery in his dealings. Half the room swore he had complained of chest pains earlier in the week. The other half insisted he had never been healthier. Gossip in Flaxborough was always plentiful, but tonight it had blossomed like fungus after rain. Purbright allowed Love to plough through the questioning while he drifted nearer the plinth. The velvet cushion bore the telltale smear of dust he had noticed earlier, but what struck him now was the faint impression of something small and square beside it, as though a box had been briefly set down and removed. He brushed the dust with one finger, then concealed his interest by adjusting the cloth. No one else appeared to have seen it. Behind him, a nervous laugh broke the rhythm of murmurs. He turned to find Mrs. Durdle, the librarian, fanning herself with a program. Her eyes glittered in a way that owed more to agitation than faintness. I never touched him, Inspector. I only saw him fall. The cup was right there, and then it wasn't." Purbright regarded her steadily. "And what were you doing by the plinth, Mrs. Durdle?" "I was reading the plaque. Just reading. I'm a librarian, Inspector. It is my duty to read things." She flushed crimson. "Then he fell and... oh, it was dreadful." The inspector inclined his head, not pressing. The faint powder on Raxby's tie returned to his mind, its silver polish unmistakable. If the councillor had touched the cup, had he been attempting to lift it or prevent someone else from doing so? Sergeant Love joined him, looking harassed. "Sir, half of them are giving each other alibis, and the other half are swearing they saw nothing. One fellow even claims he never arrived, though I distinctly saw him, with a plate of sausage rolls." "That," murmured Purbright, "may be the first honest statement tonight." Love blinked. "How so?" "Because admitting one's absence when one was present is a curious inversion, Sergeant. The sort of thing a nervous mind might blurt. We shall note him carefully." At that moment, Constable Trimble reappeared, having made another circuit of the corridors. "Inspector, I found no one outside, but—" He hesitated. The side door shows scuff marks on the threshold, as if dragged across, and a faint wet patch, like spilt wine. Purbright's brow lifted slightly. "Interesting. Raxby's wineglass?" Trimble nodded. "Still on the table, sir. Half full." The inspector turned slowly, letting his gaze sweep the assembled crowd. They were restless now, eager to be released, yet unwilling to appear too eager. He noted those who pressed forward with explanations, those who lingered back in silence, and those who stared too intently at the covered body. Each told him something, though not in words. Love sighed, closing his notebook. "It's a muddle, sir. Poison, theft, collapse, vengeance. They can't all be right." Purbright smiled faintly. "No, Sergeant, but they can all be useful." He let the silence hang, knowing the crowd strained to overhear. Then he added in a soft but carrying, "The truth has a curious habit. It resists invention. But tonight we shall see how much invention Flaxborough can manage." A ripple ran through the chamber. Someone muttered an indignant denial. Another whispered, "He knows." The tension grew like a storm cloud ready to break. And yet, within that swelling atmosphere, Purbright's mind returned to one quiet detail: the faint silver polish upon Raxby's tie. It spoke of contact with the missing cup, but the manner of that contact, protective or guilty, remained hidden. To answer it, he would need to peel back the stories offered so freely tonight and discover which of them masked fear rather than vanity. For now, the inspector folded his hands and gave the order to have the chamber sealed until every guest had been accounted for. The mayor blustered, the aldermen protested, and Mrs. Durdle swooned again. But Purbright, in his mild way, had decided none would leave until the truth had begun to show itself, even faintly, in the cracks of their protestations. The council chamber remained heavy with the unease of confinement. Though the air was thick with perfume, polish, and a faint trace of trifle, beneath it ran the sharper tang of fear. Inspector Purbright had not raised his voice, nor banged a fist, nor made any grand proclamation, but by the simple act of declaring that no one should leave, he had unsettled Flaxborough far more effectively than any display of force. Respectable people disliked to be treated as suspects, especially when the possibility occurred to them that they might actually be so. Sergeant Love, conscientious but harried, resumed his slow circuit of the hall. He found Mr. Pike, landlord of the King's Arms, leaning against the buffet as if guarding it. Pike had already expressed himself with enthusiasm about conspiracies, but Love pressed him for details. "You said enemies, sir. Who would you name?" Pike's eyes flicked from side to side, enjoying the drama. "Half the council, if you ask me. Raxby blocked proposals, undercut bids, and made enemies like other men make debts. And as for that cup, why, it's been a sore point for years. He had it polished special for tonight, so folks said, though why he took such interest I never knew." "Polished?" Love repeated, his pencil halting. Pike nodded. "Saw him myself a week ago in his office, rubbing away at it with a cloth. Told me it wanted a shine to match the town's prestige. Never struck me as a man to polish anything else, mind." Love tucked that into his notes, remembering Purbright's mention of the polished dust. He cast a glance across the room at the inspector, who stood apparently idle near the plinth, yet whose eyes missed nothing. Nearby, Mrs. Dewlap continued her performance as soothsayer, now telling anyone who would listen that she had long predicted Raxby's untimely end. "Men who cheat at whist do not prosper. I said so at the bridge club. His appetite for sweets was unnatural. Poison? Pah. Overindulgence is poison enough." Her certainty drew nods from some, rolled eyes from others. But Purbright, listening in passing, marked the way she placed herself always as prophetess, rarely as participant. He found such self-importance useful. It often left the speaker blind to what she gave away. The mayor, meanwhile, had worked himself into a state of pained dignity. He complained in low tones to Alderman Teal that detaining so many respectable citizens was outrageous. Teal, sweating beneath his wig, agreed heartily. "If we allow ourselves to be treated as criminals, sir, where will it end? Flaxborough thrives on propriety." "Indeed," the mayor whispered back, "and propriety is now lying under a tablecloth in the middle of the chamber." Their unease did not escape Purbright, who wandered close enough to make them stiffen. He asked mildly, "Gentlemen, when did you last see Councillor Raxby alive and well this evening?" The mayor answered too quickly. "Not 5 minutes before the collapse. He was laughing at some remark. Quite himself." Teal nodded. "Yes, vigorous hail. No sign of distress." Purbright's expression remained bland, but his mind noted the insistence. too vigorous, too hale. Phrases repeated as if rehearsed. He thanked them politely and moved on. By now, the chamber had become a theatre of alibis. Each guest offered scraps of recollection, often contradicting one another. Councillor Peebles claimed he had spoken to Raxby moments before the fall, but a shopkeeper swore Peebles had been outside the chamber, fumbling with his coat. A pub regular insisted he had seen a shadow at the side door, while the verger maintained it had remained closed. Every contradiction was added to the inspector's quiet ledger. Sergeant Love returned, notebook fat with confusion. "Sir, they can't agree on anything. Who was near him? Who spoke to him? Whether he stumbled or was pushed? Half of it cancels the other half out." Purbright adjusted his spectacles. "That, Sergeant, is precisely what one expects when people wish both to appear helpful and to conceal what they know. Contradiction is often less about confusion than about invention." Love frowned. "Then how do we sort it, sir?" "By looking at what cannot be invented so easily." He let his gaze wander to the plinth once more. The dust smear, the impression of a box, the missing cup, all spoke with a clarity that gossip could not obscure. The clue lay not in stories, but in the silence between them. Just then, Mrs. Durdle was heard again, her voice rising in defensive protest. "I was nowhere near him when he fell. I'd gone to fetch a program from the table by the door. Everyone saw me." This was received with polite skepticism by those around her, most of whom had not. Purbright, however, turned to watch her carefully. The librarian's protest was too loud, too insistent, as though she rehearsed it for her own reassurance. He filed it away alongside the memory of her proximity to the plinth. The inspector then called the room to order with a mild, almost apologetic cough. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Love and I shall be requiring a full account of each person's movements this evening, however trivial. I appreciate that memory under strain may falter, but accuracy is vital." Groans and mutters greeted this, but the crowd settled. One by one, they were coaxed into describing their comings and goings, where they had stood during the mayor's speech, who they had spoken to, what they had noticed. Purbright listened without expression, but Love saw the tiny flickers of interest, an eyebrow lifted here, a pause prolonged there, that meant the inspector's quiet mind was threading connections. When it came to Mr. Creek, the ironmonger, he swore loudly that he had never left his spot near the buffet. Yet Love, recalling the earlier remark about contracts, pressed him. "And did you have any dealings with Councillor Raxby yourself, sir?" Creek coloured. "None worth speaking of. He owed me nothing. I owed him nothing." Purbright's gaze softened, but his words were mild. "Nothing worth speaking of, Mr. Creek, is often precisely the sort of thing that becomes worth speaking of in police inquiries. We shall revisit the matter." The ironmonger swallowed, his hands knotting together. As the roll of accounts continued, Constable Trimble returned once more. He carried a handkerchief in which something small was wrapped. "Inspector, I found this near the side door, under the radiator, half hidden." Purbright took it carefully. When the cloth was unwrapped, a cuff-link gleamed, plain silver but distinctive, engraved with the initials E.R. The murmurs swelled immediately. "Raxby's," someone exclaimed. "He wore those tonight." But Purbright noted the detail silently. If the cufflink had come loose, it must have been pulled. And if pulled, then not by chance. He tucked it away without comment, his calm expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. Sergeant Love, wide-eyed, leaned close. "So he was at the door, sir, trying to get out." "Or," Purbright murmured, "being helped out." The guests pressed closer, eager for confirmation, but the inspector gave none. Instead, he looked around the chamber with that same mild gaze which somehow suggested he had already seen far more than anyone realized. The unease deepened. In Flaxborough, silence was more alarming than accusation. More answers in next section. But first, what's your theory? By the time the clock above the chamber door marked 10:15, the atmosphere had grown sour with impatience. The respectable citizens of Flaxborough did not take kindly to being treated as a collective of suspects. They had come to sip sherry and hear speeches about municipal progress, not to stand sweating under chandeliers while their statements were dissected by Inspector Purbright. Murmurs of discontent swelled in waves, punctuated by sighs, coughs, and the occasional dramatic collapse into a chair. The air was heavy with grievance and eau de cologne. The mayor attempted to rally the assembly by suggesting another toast, but his voice faltered when he glanced at the covered shape on the floor. He set his glass down without drinking, which was more eloquent than words. Councillor Peebles took the opportunity to announce loudly that he had pressing business at home, but a raised eyebrow from Purbright sent him back into his seat with an expression of wounded dignity. Sergeant Love, red-faced and harassed, resumed his trudging interviews. He had managed to coax a story out of nearly everyone present, and each story contradicted the others. By now, his notebook resembled a battlefield of scratched-out words and exclamation marks. He joined Purbright near the plinth, lowering his voice. "Sir, they're beginning to turn on each other. If we don't let some out, they'll be tearing at one another's alibis with their teeth." Purbright's gaze moved slowly across the restless chamber. "Sometimes, Sergeant, it is instructive to see what people do when their patience is tested. A mask rarely slips when comfortably worn." Love frowned, but said nothing, aware that the inspector preferred observation to interruption. He followed his superior's eyes to Mrs. Durdle, who was whispering furiously with Mrs. Dewlap. Their heads were close, their expressions animated. A moment later, Mrs. Dewlap raised her voice in outrage, declaring, "I saw Councillor Raxby arguing with Creek not an hour before his death." The ironmonger all but threatened him. Creek flushed crimson, fists balling. "Lies, madam, sheer invention. I've had no quarrel with the man beyond what any ratepayer has with a councillor." The room, delighted with this diversion, erupted with speculation. Voices overlapped in a chorus of accusation. It was at that precise moment that the scandal escalated. From the far side of the chamber came a crash of glass, followed by a cry of horror. All heads swiveled toward the buffet table, where Alderman Teal stood, his wig askew once more, staring down at the great tureen of punch. Floating in the ruby liquid was a second silver cufflink, its engraving glinting under the light. ER. For a moment there was silence, then pandemonium. Ladies clutched pearls, men barked theories, and the verger crossed himself with such vigor he nearly toppled backwards. The mayor declared in strangled tones that the discovery was absolutely monstrous. Mrs. Dewlap screamed, perhaps more from the loss of a good punch than from horror. Purbright stepped forward, his calmness a pointed contrast to the surrounding hysteria. He lifted the cufflink carefully out with a spoon and held it up to the light. "2 cufflinks are, Sergeant. One by the side door, the other in the punch bowl. Curious symmetry." Love scribbled furiously. "He must have been dragged, sir, from the plinth to the door, struggling. One cufflink torn, the other shaken loose and fallen in the bowl." "Possibly," Purbright murmured, though one wonders why a man being dragged would end in the buffet and not the door. The guests buzzed like a hive prodded with a stick. Accusations multiplied. Creek muttered darkly that Raxby had staged some drama to cover theft. Mrs. Durdle insisted she saw hands near the punch, just before the body fell. The mayor demanded immediate order, which was ignored. Purbright raised a hand. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Ladies and gentlemen, the discovery of a second cufflink complicates matters, but let us not mistake noise for clarity. Councillor Raxby's death is no less mysterious than it was 10 minutes ago, and the missing cup remains absent. I ask you to consider how might both be explained together." The silence that followed was sharp with unspoken theories. Some looked down at their shoes, others at the chandelier, unwilling to meet the inspector's gaze. Teal mopped his brow with a handkerchief, muttering that the council would never recover from such disgrace. The verger whispered a prayer. Love leaned closer, his voice low. "Sir, it seems planted. Why else would anyone drop it in the punch?" Purbright replaced the cufflink in his pocket, perhaps to ensure it was found. There are times, Sergeant, when people do not wish evidence to be lost. The chamber seethed with speculation, but Purbright moved back toward the plinth, studying the dust trail once more. In the flicker of lamplight, he thought he saw another faint smear on the floor, as if something heavy had been set down briefly before being lifted again. Not the cup, but perhaps a box, or a case in which it had been hidden. He crouched, touched the mark with one finger, and said nothing. Let the crowd chatter, he thought. Silence would reveal more. The night pressed on. Some guests slumped in chairs, weary of the suspense. Others whispered furiously, trading theories like currency. Flaxborough had never been so entertained, nor so affronted by a civic evening. Yet beneath the gossip ran a current of unease that no amount of chatter could mask. One of them was lying, and Inspector Purbright intended to discover who. The council chamber had become a restless hive after the discovery of the second cufflink. Whispers spread faster than any constable could hope to contain. It was no longer enough to speculate on whether Councillor Raxby had collapsed of natural causes or been dispatched by foul play. Now the guests demanded to know why his belongings appeared scattered like cryptic breadcrumbs across the scene. Some muttered of robbery, others of scandal, and still others claimed it was proof of a secret quarrel. What united them all was the pressing desire that the inspector fix the blame quickly, preferably upon someone else in the room. Sergeant Love, perspiring with the effort of managing so many contradictory voices, finally managed to corral Mr. Creek, the ironmonger, into a chair. The man's ruddy face and bullish stance did him no favors under the scrutiny of his fellow citizens. "I've told you before," Creek barked, "I had no quarrel with Raxby. None that mattered. A councillor makes decisions. Tradesmen don't always like them. So what? That doesn't make me a murderer." Love scribbled in his notebook but kept his tone mild. "It seems, though, that several present heard you arguing with him earlier in the evening." Creek's eyes darted toward Mrs. Dewlap, who gave a triumphant sniff. "A disagreement, nothing more. He was pressing for a new contractor on the town hall repairs, and I said the price was robbery. He called me obstinate, I called him something stronger, and that was that. Anyone who says otherwise is twisting it." The murmurs rose. People enjoyed hearing the quarrel confirmed. In their eyes, the ironmonger's temper had painted him neatly into the role of suspect. Purbright, standing a little apart, observed without comment. His expression was calm, even kind, but his eyes were restless, flicking from Creek's defiance to the hungry faces watching him. The crowd wanted resolution, and if Creek provided a target, they were ready to seize it. Mrs. Durdle, wringing her hands, declared loudly that she had seen Creek hovering near the plinth not long before Raxby's fall. "He was close enough to touch the cup. I swear it. He pretended to be looking at the velvet, but he had his eyes on the silver. And then, when poor Councillor Raxby collapsed, who was nearest? Mr. Creek, I remember it plainly." Her certainty struck like a match in dry tinder. The chamber filled with mutters of agreement. Several nodded eagerly, as though they too recalled the scene now that Mrs. Durdle had supplied it. Creek leapt to his feet, his voice booming over theirs. "Lies! I never touched the cup. I stood no nearer than anyone else." Purbright finally spoke, his tone soft but carrying. "Mr. Creek, would you be so good as to tell us precisely where you were standing when Councillor Raxby fell?" "By the buffet," Creek snapped. "With Pike. We were speaking of trade." All eyes turned to the landlord of the King's Arms. Pike shifted uncomfortably. "We spoke, yes, but not then. Earlier, at the start of the speeches. After that, I moved to fetch another glass, and Creek, well, I can't say exactly where he was." The silence that followed was damning. The crowd stirred, eyes narrowing, shoulders turning. It was as though the collective mind of Flaxborough had decided here was the guilty man. Creek's protestations were swallowed by the tide of suspicion. Sergeant Love leaned close to Purbright, whispering urgently, "It fits, sir. The argument, the missing alibi, the chance near the plinth, and he's strong enough to have dragged Raxby if it came to it." Purbright's reply was characteristically mild. "It fits, yes, but so does an ill-tailored coat until one examines the seams." He turned his gaze back to the ironmonger, who now stood red-faced and trembling under the scrutiny of his neighbors. The man's fists clenched and unclenched, as though he might strike his accusers at any moment. Yet Purbright noted the detail others missed, a smear of polish upon the man's sleeve, not the metallic gleam of silver polish, but the duller wax used on wood. A sign of recent work in his shop, not of handling a trophy. Nevertheless, the chamber seized upon the false suspect with relish. Voices rose, demanding Creek be taken away. Some even urged the inspector to search his premises at once. Mrs. Dewlap fanned herself furiously and declared that no woman in Flaxborough would sleep soundly until he was behind bars. Creek roared in fury, which only confirmed the crowd's judgment in their eyes. Purbright let the storm rage for a time, watching carefully. He had learned that suspicion revealed more about the accusers than the accused. The loudest voices often had the most to hide. He observed Mrs. Durdle, her eyes bright with triumph, and Mrs. Dewlap, almost glowing with vindication. Pike looked down into his glass, avoiding notice. The mayor wrung his hands. Teal mopped his brow again. Each detail was stored away. At last, Purbright raised his hand. The chamber quieted reluctantly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I remind you that anger is not evidence, and outrage is not proof. Mr. Creek's quarrel with Councillor Raxby may have been intemperate, but I have yet to hear a single fact that connects him to either the missing cup or the councillor's death." A ripple of discontent ran through the crowd. They had hoped for a resolution, and the inspector had denied them. Creek seized the moment, roaring that he would not be made a scapegoat. His defiance earned him few sympathizers, but it shifted the mood enough to cool the fever. For the moment, suspicion remained heavy on him, but not as certain as before. Love sighed, closing his notebook. "Sir, you've let him slip away. The crowd won't like it." Purbright adjusted his spectacles. "The crowd, Sergeant, likes whatever story makes them feel cleverest, but the truth, unfortunately, has no such obligation." As if to underscore his words, Constable Trimble entered, clutching another object in his large hands. He cleared his throat nervously. "Inspector, I found this under one of the benches near the back. Looks to have been kicked aside." He held up a half-empty bottle of sherry. Its cork was missing, and the rim bore smudges of lipstick. A low murmur ran through the guests. Several pairs of eyes turned toward Mrs. Durdle, whose lips, bright red, matched the marks. She paled visibly. Purbright regarded her without expression. "Curious. A bottle hidden, a councillor dead, and a cup missing. Sometimes, Sergeant, one must ask not who could have done it, but who profits most from confusion." Mrs. Durdle opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her face stricken. Creek, forgotten for the moment, seized upon her silence with a savage grin. The chamber's loyalties shifted once more, like reeds in the wind. The bottle of sherry now sat on the council table like a silent witness, its lipstick-stained rim gleaming under the chandelier. Though no one had yet accused Mrs. Durdle directly, the collective gaze of the assembly bore down upon her with such intensity that her handkerchief twisted in knots beneath her fingers. She shifted in her chair, pale and stiff, eyes darting between Inspector Purbright and the door she could not reach. Creek, momentarily reprieved, leaned back with a grunt of satisfaction, as though her discomfort had balanced his humiliation. The crowd's suspicion had simply transferred hosts. Sergeant Love, seeing the tension, tried to advance the inquiry with brisk practicality. "Madame, perhaps you could explain how your lipstick came to decorate a bottle discovered under a bench when all respectable refreshment was laid openly on the tables." He held his notebook as if its pages might force the truth out of her. Mrs. Durdle gave a brittle laugh. "Inspector Sergeant, surely it is no crime to sip a little extra sherry in the course of such a long evening?" I had tucked it away from prying eyes. Ladies are judged harshly for enjoying more than one glass. I admit it freely, but that is all. It has nothing to do with poor Councillor Raxby's collapse. The crowd hummed with scorn. Mrs. Dewlap sniffed so loudly it might have carried to the street outside. Disgraceful, hiding bottles like a common tippler. And at the council gala, it tells you everything, Inspector, about the sort of woman we have in charge of our books. Several nodded in agreement, finding the moral indictment as persuasive as any forensic evidence. Purbright's expression, however, betrayed neither condemnation nor sympathy. He simply regarded Mrs. Durdle for a long moment and then turned back to Sergeant Love. "Note it down. Hidden drink, concealed indulgence, discovered only by chance. It may yet have bearing, though not the sort her neighbors imagine." Love obeyed, though his brow furrowed. "You don't think it points to guilt, sir?" "Guilt of something, certainly," Purbright said quietly, "but not necessarily murder." The atmosphere of the chamber grew ever more febrile. The respectable citizens who had begun the night by preening in their finery now sat rumpled and resentful, muttering darkly about being detained so long. The mayor attempted again to restore dignity by calling for calm, but his plea was drowned by the sudden slam of the great doors at the back of the hall. The constables stationed outside stumbled inward, capless and breathless. One managed to gasp, "Inspector, there's been a disturbance outside. The press have gathered." A groan went up from the council members. Flaxborough's scandal was no longer confined within the walls. Through the tall windows, the bobbing lights of lanterns could already be seen, and faint voices carried in the night. Journalists from the county paper had scented drama, and the promise of both death and disgrace drew them like moths. Several guests rose to protest. "You cannot allow them in," shouted Alderman Teal, tugging at his wig in panic. "This is a private tragedy, not a spectacle." But already the reporters' questions could be heard hammering against the doors. "Is it murder? Who was found with the body? What happened to the Jubilee Cup?" Purbright raised his hand, and the noise within subsided, though the pounding outside did not. His voice remained even. "Keep the doors closed, Constable. This chamber will hold enough noise without adding theirs." Yet he did not dismiss the matter lightly. The arrival of the press meant rumors would travel unchecked before the night was out, and sometimes rumors influenced suspects more than facts. Mrs. Durdle, clutching her shawl, moaned softly about being ruined in print. Creek swore that his shop would suffer. The mayor fretted about the council's reputation. Only Purbright seemed untroubled, though his eyes flickered with quiet calculation. He'd observed how each person reacted to the threat of public exposure, and those reactions told him much. Fear of scandal, he thought, could be a sharper spur than fear of justice. As the hubbub began to settle, Constable Trimble came forward once more, his heavy tread cautious. In his hands, he bore an envelope, creased and slightly damp. "Inspector," he said, "I found this under the buffet table. Must have been kicked there in the commotion." He handed it over with the care of a man who disliked responsibility. Purbright opened the envelope carefully. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper covered in hurried scrawl. He read silently while the crowd craned their necks. At last, he looked up, his face unreadable. "It appears to be a note, addressed to Councillor Raxby. It reads, 'The cup is not yours to polish, nor to claim. You flaunt it tonight at your peril. Justice comes quickly.'" The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps, cries, and exclamations of horror filled the chamber. The words were read again aloud by Sergeant Love, his voice shaking with excitement. "A threat, sir, a direct threat." The crowd surged with speculation, eager to attach the words to someone. The verger muttered about divine vengeance. Mrs. Dewlap accused Creek once more. Pike shook his head grimly, muttering that he'd warned everyone of shady dealings. Alderman Teal nearly fainted, convinced the note would drag the whole council into disrepute. Love pressed closer to Purbright, whispering fiercely, "This is it, sir. The proof. Someone threatened him over the cup, and now he's dead. It ties together." Purbright folded the note calmly and slipped it into his pocket. "Proof of ill will, perhaps. But threats, Sergeant, are often made most loudly by those with the least intention to carry them out. Sometimes the pen is wielded to frighten rather than to act." "But then why leave it here?" Love demanded. "That, Sergeant, is precisely the question." The guests erupted again, some shouting for the culprit to confess, others insisting on their innocence. Creek roared over them all that he had written no such thing, while Mrs. Durdle wailed that she had only admired the cup from a distance. Purbright let the uproar crest before raising his hand once more. His voice cut through the din, calm but absolute. "This chamber will remain sealed. I require each of you to remain seated until I have finished with your accounts. We now have evidence of motive. Whether that motive belonged to the writer of the note or another remains to be seen." The crowd sank back, subdued but simmering. Outside, the press clamored, inside the council squirmed, and above it all, Purbright moved quietly, his mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. A dead councillor with polish on his tie, a vanished cup, scattered cufflinks, a hidden bottle, and now a threatening note. Each clue was like a voice in a quarrel, insisting on being heard. But which spoke the truth, and which only added to the noise? The inspector closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again with renewed clarity. The night had grown darker, but the case had begun to take shape. The chamber quivered with the discovery of the note, as though every respectable seat and panelled wall had suddenly become complicit in a threat. People shifted uneasily, the scrape of chairs echoing in the tense air. The mayor's face sagged into his hands, muttering that the town's reputation had been dragged into ruin. Mrs. Dewlap was busy instructing anyone who would listen that handwriting revealed character, and that she could recognize a villainous flourish at 20 paces. Creek folded his arms with a grunt, determined to show that the suspicion had passed from him, though his eyes remained watchful. Mrs. Durdle dabbed at her forehead with a damp handkerchief, her lips pressed tightly together, as if one more whisper of accusation might undo her entirely. Sergeant Love was still flushed with excitement, his notebook trembling in his hand. "It narrows it, sir. Someone in this room threatened him over the cup. If we examine handwriting, compare samples, we can pin it down before midnight." He looked almost eager, as though justice could be managed with the efficiency of a post office ledger. Purbright, however, gazed thoughtfully at the crowd. "A sensible suggestion, Sergeant, and one that might amuse our guests. But consider, if the writer of the note intended it to be discovered, it has already served its purpose. If not, then its presence here tells us of haste or of carelessness. In either case, the handwriting may be less important than the timing." Love blinked, then frowned. "You mean it could have been planted tonight?" "Possibly." Purbright adjusted his spectacles. "Or it could have been meant for Raxby to find alone, not shared with all of Flaxborough. That he did not live long enough to read it complicates matters." He let the words settle. Around him, people exchanged furtive glances. Some shifted in their seats as though their bodies had betrayed them. Constable Trimble, heavy-footed and earnest, broke the silence by announcing that another search of the adjoining corridors had turned up nothing but muddy prints leading in from the garden door. The mud was fresh, tracked upon the stone floor as though someone had entered hastily. This revelation sent the assembly into new agitation. The mayor groaned that the town would now be said to harbor nocturnal burglars. Mrs. Dewlap swore she had seen no mud, though her shoes bore flecks that suggested otherwise. Teal muttered about closing all exits and having the constable stand guard. The inspector knelt briefly to examine the prints where Trimble had marked them. They were smudged, blurred by haste, and gave no clue to size. Still, they confirmed what he already suspected. Movement in and out of the hall had been more fluid than the guests admitted. He rose slowly, dusting his hands, and allowed the crowd to squirm under the weight of his silence. Love leaned closer again, lowering his voice. "It's narrowing, sir. The cup, the prints. Whoever came in by that door could have taken both Raxby's life and the cup. If we—" He broke off as another commotion rose. This time it came from the far end of the hall, where a young council clerk, pale and visibly frightened, held up a folded document he claimed to have found among the speeches on the lectern. At once, the room buzzed. The clerk, stumbling over his words, explained that he had gone to fetch his coat and noticed the paper fluttering loose. It was an official-looking file, stamped with the council's seal, but inside was no speech, only a list of names, figures, and notes scribbled in Raxby's unmistakable hand. The contents suggested private dealings, land allocations, sums exchanged, initials of councillors beside amounts that could not be explained as legitimate fees. The uproar was instantaneous. Several councillors protested loudly that the paper was a forgery. Others shouted that it was scandalous to bring such matters to light in front of outsiders. The mayor demanded it be sealed immediately, but the clerk had already waved it before too many eyes. The gossip spread like fire through straw. Flaxborough's Gala had now been transformed into the stage for accusations of corruption. Purbright accepted the paper from the trembling clerk and studied it without expression. He noted how the ink was recent, the handwriting hasty, as though composed in nervous secrecy. He folded it neatly and placed it with the threatening note in his pocket. His words, when they came, were measured. Whether genuine or not, this document must be preserved. If Councillor Raxby had dealings that endangered him, they cannot be ignored. The effect was devastating. Councillor Peebles shouted that his initials had been misused. Teal flapped his handkerchief as though fanning away guilt itself. The mayor muttered incoherently about enemies of progress. The respectable gathering was no longer united in outrage. It was divided, every man and woman watching the other for betrayal. Suspicions leapt from face to face. Whispers of "he gained from it" or "she must have known" filled the air like gnats. Purbright let the storm roll over him, watching who flinched most at the mention of certain names. Love, notebook wobbling, whispered, "So that's it, sir." Blackmail. Raxby kept accounts on his colleagues, and someone silenced him before he could use them. "Perhaps," Purbright said gently, "or perhaps he was the one silenced because the cup was worth more than silver polish. Let us not hurry to conclusions, Sergeant. Haste is the mother of error." As the uproar continued, the reporters outside grew louder, demanding details of murder and scandal. Their voices carried through the heavy doors. The townsfolk inside felt trapped, surrounded by both suspicion and the hungry world beyond. The claustrophobia was palpable. Then came the final jolt of the night's second scandal. Constable Trimble, returning from yet another inspection of the garden door, announced in a strained voice that a sack had been discovered in the shrubbery just outside. It was brought in and laid upon the floor before the assembly. When opened, it revealed not the Jubilee cup itself, but the velvet-lined box that once contained it, empty, smeared with polish, and stained faintly with what looked suspiciously like wine. The gasp that followed shook the chamber. Some cried out in horror, others in disbelief. Mrs. Durdle fainted for the second time, or perhaps the third. The mayor groaned that Flaxborough was undone. Creek shouted triumphantly that this proved nothing against him. Mrs. Dewlap whispered furiously that the box had been planted. And through it all, Purbright remained still, his calm gaze upon the empty lining. A box without its prize, found abandoned outside, suggested two things. Someone had fled, and someone had intended the cup to remain hidden. Sergeant Love spoke in hushed tones. "So it's true, sir. The cup was taken, carried out, and then the box discarded. Whoever held it may still be at large." "Or," Purbright murmured, "they may still be here, having contrived to place the box where it would be found. Sometimes the surest way to divert suspicion is to give people something obvious to look at." The chamber buzzed with fresh theories, each more tangled than the last. The crowd's earlier certainty was crumbling into chaos. Faces once bold now looked hunted, and at the center of it all, Inspector Purbright stood mild and patient, watching as guilt, fear, and lies began to show themselves in every shifting glance. The empty box sat on the floorboards like a coffin stripped of its occupant, its velvet lining darkened with smears of polish and wine. The crowd stared at it as if it might at any moment confess. The weight of revelation, first the note, then the ledger, and now this box, had drained much of their anger, leaving in its place a kind of wary exhaustion. Flaxborough's finest no longer looked like dignitaries gathered for a gala. They looked like travelers trapped in a stalled train, each suspecting the other of pocket-picking. Inspector Purbright stood with his hands loosely folded, his eyes traveling from face to face. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until people shifted in their seats, rubbed at their throats, whispered excuses to themselves. When he did speak, his voice was mild. "Each of you has given some account of your evening, but what you think unimportant may be what matters most. Councillor Raxby is dead, the cup has vanished, and yet I suspect the key lies not in what happened after his fall, but in what happened before." That statement hung in the air like a bell toll. Sergeant Love, seizing the moment, stepped forward with his notebook. "We'll need more detail then, sir. Names, movements, times. No one leaves until it's written." Groans and protests followed, but the inspector's calm presence subdued them. He began with Councillor Peebles, who had earlier insisted on his innocence by overemphasis. Purbright asked gently, "Where were you when the speeches began, Councillor?" Peebles cleared his throat. "By the buffet, naturally. I always prefer to be near the refreshments." "Curious," Purbright murmured. "Several witnesses place you near the side door at the same time." Peebles flushed, checking my coat. The draft was intolerable. His indignation came too swiftly, and though no one could disprove him, the seeds of suspicion fell into fertile soil. He sat down heavily, glaring at those who dared to look thoughtful. Next, Purbright turned to Alderman Teal. The man's wig had slipped again, giving him a dishevelled air quite unsuited to his usual pomposity. "Alderman, when did you last speak to Councillor Raxby?" Teal hesitated, then blustered. "Not at all tonight. We passed words at the committee meeting last week, but I had no need of him this evening." A cough from the back interrupted. Pike, the landlord, recalled clearly that Teal and Raxby had been in a heated discussion by the door not long before the speeches. Teal paled, then attempted to deny it, but his words were drowned by a ripple of whispers. His protestations, like Peebles's, were only fuel for suspicion. Purbright allowed the contradictions to swell, then quieted the room with a single remark. "It seems Councillor Raxby had more conversations tonight than he could possibly have managed alone. Either he was the most sociable man in Flaxborough, or someone was fabricating the company." The crowd muttered uneasily. Several people avoided his gaze as though eye contact might link them to invention. Mrs. Durdle, in particular, fidgeted with her shawl, her face flushed. Purbright, watching closely, asked in his soft way, "And you, madam, when you admired the cup earlier, did you notice anyone else nearby?" She stammered. "Only Creek. I have said so already. He was standing so near it looked suspicious." "Yes," Purbright said gently. "You did say so. But you also said you were by the door, fetching a program. 2 places at once is a feat even for a librarian." The chamber hummed with delight at this contradiction, though a few faces sobered quickly. Mrs. Durdle, caught, sank back in her seat. Purbright noted her distress, but pressed no further. He had learned that suspects who entangle themselves need no knots tied by others. The questioning continued, slower now, but purposeful. Purbright's aim was not to trap, but to listen, to the hesitations, the defensiveness, the eagerness to divert suspicion elsewhere. He noticed how the mayor grew louder each time corruption was mentioned, drowning out quiet voices. He marked how Mrs. Dewlep's moral scorn increased whenever the missing cup was brought up, as if indignation might substitute for an alibi. And he observed Pike's careful neutrality, his tendency to confirm details that incriminated others but offered nothing of himself. Gradually, the inspector wove a picture of the room that night, a map of glances, movements, and silences. It was less a plan of facts than of pressure points. Who feared disgrace, who feared discovery, who feared justice. He began to sense that Raxby's death was not a simple matter of sudden violence, but the result of tensions long festering, a web in which more than one person tugged at the threads. Sergeant Love grew restless. "Sir, we're chasing shadows. One says black, the other says white. None of it holds together." Purbright looked at him with that quiet patience. "Contradictions are not failures, Sergeant. They are signposts. When people trip over their own words, they tell us where to look." Love sighed but nodded, trusting his superior's calm certainty. Outside, the press hammered again at the doors. Their voices shouted names, demands, and accusations. The councillors winced, knowing tomorrow's headlines would stain their reputations, whatever Purbright uncovered tonight. The pressure was mounting, and with pressure came mistakes. It was then that Mrs. Dewlep, bristling with indignation, declared, "We sit here like criminals while the real villain goes free. For all we know, the cup is already on the black market in Lincoln. Inspector, you must arrest someone, if only to show authority." Purbright regarded her steadily. "Arresting someone to satisfy appearances, madam, would solve nothing, though it may reveal much about those urging it." Her face reddened, and she sat down abruptly, but the damage was done. People had seen her eagerness to redirect blame, and they filed it away. The hour was late, the air oppressive. Yet Purbright felt the threads tightening. He had seen in each face the flicker of fear, of calculation, of misplaced confidence. The pieces had not yet fallen, but he sensed the pattern forming. The cup's disappearance, Raxby's death, the ledger, the cufflinks, the threatening note, all connected, though not in the way anyone imagined. He gave the order at last for the guests to be escorted into smaller rooms for rest and further questioning. The mayor protested about dignity, but the inspector's mild insistence brooked no resistance. As people filed out, Purbright stood alone near the plinth, gazing at the faint smear of dust where the cup had once rested. He placed his hand lightly upon it, as though feeling for a pulse. His eyes narrowed. "Not what it seems," he murmured softly, too quiet for anyone but himself. The long night pressed on, and though the guests had been guided into smaller rooms adjoining the chamber, their voices carried through the panelled corridors like muffled echoes of a quarrel. The council gala had become less an evening of civic pride and more a siege of reputation. Constables moved in pairs, keeping watch on doorways, their heavy boots tapping reminders that no one would slip away unseen. Outside, the press still clamored, their voices hoarse with demands, but the heavy oak doors held them back. Inside, it was not the cold, but the scrutiny of Inspector Purbright that kept everyone restless. He remained in the chamber, his mild face tilted toward the plinth that no longer bore its trophy. Sergeant Love hovered near the window, rubbing condensation from the glass, to peer at the lights bobbing in the square. "They won't quit till morning, sir. Every hour we keep them out there, the stories get taller. By dawn, Raxby will have been strangled, poisoned, and stabbed all at once." Purbright did not look up, and perhaps risen again to sell the cup in Lincoln Market if gossip can manage it. His tone carried no mockery, but Love caught the faint trace of irony. He'd long since learned that the inspector used humor not to dismiss, but to sharpen the point. "Tell me, Sergeant, what strikes you most about tonight?" Love frowned. "The contradiction, sir. Everyone swears to one thing, but each account knocks down another. If they mean to help, they've a strange way of showing it." "Or," Purbright said softly, "they mean to help themselves." Before Love could reply, the door creaked open and Constable Trimble shuffled in, his cap in his hands. He cleared his throat nervously. "Inspector, a matter you should see, in the mayor's retiring room." The three of them crossed into the smaller chamber where the mayor sat slumped in a chair, his chain of office askew, his complexion grey. Before him on the table lay a bundle of papers, hastily gathered, their corners bent. The mayor jumped when Purbright entered, his hands fluttering as though caught with contraband. "Inspector, I was only securing council property. Sensitive papers, you understand. Best kept out of sight until this dreadful affair is resolved." Purbright's eyes rested on the bundle. "Sensitive indeed, if they could not wait until morning. May I?" The mayor hesitated, then pushed the papers forward. They contained correspondence, minutes of meetings, and a draft speech, nothing incriminating at first glance. But within the pile lay a letter bearing Raxby's hand, addressed to the mayor himself. Purbright read it silently. Veiled complaints about obstruction, threats to reveal mismanagement, and a clear warning that unless matters of finance were put in order, Raxby would take them beyond the council chamber. The mayor stammered. He was always blustering, Inspector. You know the sort of man, never content unless wagging a finger. Purbright folded the letter carefully and returned it to the bundle. His expression gave nothing away. Bluster, perhaps. Yet sometimes the threat of truth is more dangerous than the truth itself. The mayor's lips trembled. He attempted a smile, but it crumbled at the corners. Purbright thanked him mildly and left him to his misery. Back in the chamber, Sergeant Love exhaled heavily. So the mayor had his quarrel too. That makes 3 councillors with reason to wish Raxby quiet. If we keep digging, sir, we'll find the whole chamber ready to dance on his grave. Perhaps, Purbright murmured, but one danced sooner. The night dragged forward. Statements were taken, repeated and contradicted. Some guests grew bolder, others more subdued. Mrs. Dewlap, still convinced her moral compass pointed unerringly to guilt, whispered that Mrs. Durdle had grown pale enough to betray herself. Mrs. Durdle, clutching her shawl, muttered that Creek's temper was proof of violence. Creek insisted that Pike was slippery. Pike muttered that Peebles was evasive, and Peebles in turn declared Teal a liar. In Flaxborough, it seemed, no one was innocent once gossip took charge, but even gossip was silenced by the next revelation. It was near midnight when Trimble once again entered, this time more pale than before. In his hands, he carried a bundle wrapped in a cloth. He placed it gently on the table, his voice unsteady. "Found it, sir, in the coal scuttle at the end of the corridor." The room held its breath as Purbright unwrapped the cloth. There, dulled by soot but unmistakable, lay the missing silver Jubilee cup. Its surface bore smudges of polish and grime, and around its base clung faint streaks of what might have been mousse or wine. The sight of it struck the chamber like thunder. The missing prize had not fled to distant markets. It had been hidden within yards of the scene. The uproar was immediate. "Planted!" cried Creek, hidden by the guilty to frame another. Mrs. Dewlap gasped that such desecration of a civic treasure proved madness. The mayor nearly wept with relief that the town's pride had been found, though his joy faltered when he realized the recovery raised more questions than it answered. Sergeant Love bent over the cup, frowning. "So it never left the building, sir. All the noise about unlocked doors and muddy prints. Smoke screen, wasn't it?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, turning the cup slowly in his hands. "But ask yourself, Sergeant, who would have both access to the scuttle and reason to hide it there? It is not a place for hasty thieves. It suggests deliberation. Love swallowed. Someone who knew the building well, then. Council staff, maybe. Or one of the councillors. Purbright set the cup back upon the table, his fingers brushing the rim thoughtfully. His gaze wandered to the soot that coated it, and then to the faint line of polish still caught in the grooves of the engraving. The cup has travelled far tonight, though not in miles. The murmurs swelled again, accusations darting from one side of the chamber to the other. The fragile alliances of Flaxborough society fractured further, leaving each person more alone than before. Outside, the press shouted, louder, sensing upheaval. Inside, the guests shifted uneasily, aware that the inspector's calm eyes had measured each of them against the tarnished shine of the recovered cup. And yet, as Purbright looked around the room, his mind rested not on the loudest accusers, nor the most flustered defenders, but on those who had grown quieter as the night wore on. For silence, he thought, could weigh heavier than words. The cup had been found, but the hand that placed it in the scuttle remained hidden. And in that secrecy lay the heart of the matter, still pulsing unseen. The sight of the recovered cup on the council table did not soothe the chamber. It unsettled it further. Its soot-darkened surface seemed less a symbol of pride than of contamination, as though Flaxborough's very respectability had been dragged through coal dust. No one wanted to claim the relief of finding it, for to do so was to risk being associated with whoever had hidden it. The mayor wrung his hands and muttered about arranging for a professional polish, while Mrs. Dewlap declared she would never drink from it again if her life depended on it. Creek barked that the whole matter proved a conspiracy, though he could not say whose. Mrs. Durdle, pale and trembling, whispered that perhaps the cup itself was cursed. Each suggestion filled the air like smoke, thickening the confusion. Inspector Purbright regarded the tarnished trophy with mild detachment, as if it were a patient object rather than an explosive accusation. His gaze shifted slowly from the cup to the faces around him. "When an object is hidden," he said gently, "it is often less important where it was found than why it was placed there. A thief seeks concealment. A liar seeks discovery at the right moment." His words sank into the silence, provoking more discomfort than clarity. Sergeant Love leaned close, his voice urgent. "So which is it, sir? Concealment or discovery?" Purbright adjusted his spectacles, his eyes thoughtful. "That, Sergeant, depends on who benefits most from confusion." Love frowned, but scribbled in his notebook all the same. He was beginning to see that Purbright's questions often mattered more than his answers. The constables ushered the guests back into the main chamber for another round of scrutiny. Their expressions told the story of the night. Fatigue lined every face, tempers lay close to breaking point, and patience had worn into suspicion. The councillors sat stiffly, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. The shopkeepers whispered to their spouses. The verger clasped his prayer book as if holding a shield. Even Pike, normally genial, stared at the floor with a furrowed brow. Only the inspector seemed untouched by the hour. Purbright began anew, addressing the assembly in his mild voice. "The cup has been found, though not in the condition we would wish. Councillor Raxby is still dead, though perhaps not for the reasons first imagined. What remains is to discover who among you has woven truth with falsehood, and why." This pronouncement ignited another round of accusations. Mrs. Dewlap pointed again to Creek, certain his quarrel proved guilt. Creek countered that Dewlap had profited from Raxby's decisions and perhaps feared exposure. Peebles barked that Teal was the real villain, citing their earlier quarrel. Teal sputtered that Peebles was drunk half the evening and unreliable. The chamber buzzed like a hive disturbed, each voice stinging another. Purbright let the clamour rise and fall, noting who shouted loudest, who protested too quickly, and who sat in silence. Then came a startling intervention. Pike, the landlord, rose from his chair, his face red with a mixture of wine and frustration. We'll be here till dawn with no more answers than we had at the start. I say search everyone, turn out their pockets, their bags, their papers. If someone is guilty, let it be proved." His outburst was met with startled murmurs. Some agreed eagerly, sensing a chance to clear their names. Others recoiled in outrage at the indignity. Purbright, however, lifted a hand, quieting the noise. "An interesting suggestion, Mr. Pike, but guilt is not always carried in pockets." The landlord sat down, chastened, though his outburst had sown fresh suspicion. Eyes turned toward him, remembering his earlier reticence. Sergeant Love leaned toward Purbright. He was keen to push it away from himself, sir. "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Sometimes eagerness to expose others is a shadow cast by fear." As the night wore on, contradictions became more telling. The verger, pressed for details, admitted he had indeed seen someone slip near the buffet just before the collapse, but could not say who. Mrs. Durdle changed her story again, claiming she had left the chamber entirely for a moment, though earlier she had insisted she had not. Teal, sweating beneath his wig, declared loudly that Raxby had threatened many, but was vague about how. The mayor remained pale, his answers short, as though every word might entrap him further. Each statement, though small, added to the inspector's quiet ledger of inconsistencies. And then the third set piece of the evening struck. Constable Trimble, once more the reluctant herald, announced that a woman in the crowd had discovered a scrap of fabric caught on the handle of the side door. When produced, it proved to be a torn piece of lace, faintly stained. The reaction was electric. Every woman glanced at her gown, every man at his wife. Mrs. Dewlap gasped and examined her sleeve, only to find it intact. Mrs. Durdle blanched, her hand flying to the hem of her shawl where the lace trim was indeed frayed. A collective murmur swelled, suspicion shifting with the inevitability of a tide. Mrs. Durdle collapsed into her chair, protesting weakly. It caught when I passed by. Only that, Inspector, I swear. I was never near the door otherwise." Her words were drowned by whispers of liar and caught red-handed. Creek bellowed triumphantly that he had said she was near the plinth, and now the proof had shown itself. The chamber, desperate for resolution, leaned heavily toward condemnation. Sergeant Love whispered urgently, "This is it, sir. The lace, the bottle, the contradictions. She's the one." Purbright, however, studied her quietly, his gaze resting not on her frayed shawl, but on the faces around her. The eagerness with which they turned on her told him more than the fabric. He said gently, "Perhaps, or perhaps she's only convenient. In Flaxborough, the difference is often blurred." But he pressed no further, allowing the tension to settle into unease. For Purbright had seen something else. In the corner of the cup, where soot clung stubbornly, a faint trace of ink, smudged as if the trophy had brushed across a written page. That detail he kept to himself. It would matter later, when silence had spoken long enough. The guests shifted, restless, sensing the night drawing toward some conclusion, yet not knowing where it would strike. The cup had returned, the lace accused, the note threatened, the ledger condemned, but the truth remained hidden, coiled like smoke within the chamber. And Inspector Purbright, mild and observant, watched as the final pieces edged toward their place. The lace fragment fluttered faintly in Constable Trimble's hand, its delicate threads out of place amid the heavy oak and soot-darkened trophy. The assembly clung to it like drowning passengers to driftwood, desperate for certainty at last. Mrs. Durdle sat stricken, her lips moving silently as though rehearsing a dozen denials, none strong enough to survive the weight of so many eyes. The chamber, exhausted and volatile, seemed ready to close its judgment upon her. It was then that Inspector Purbright lifted the cup from the table once more and held it aloft, turning it so that the lamplight caught its tarnished surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, yet the room leaned forward to hear him, "before we allow appearances to overwhelm us, Let us consider what we know. Councillor Raxby is dead. He collapsed here at the plinth, his tie marked with silver polish. A cufflink was found by the door, another in the punch bowl. A bottle of sherry hidden beneath a bench bore lipstick. A note threatened him over the cup, and a ledger revealed secrets of council dealings. Finally, this cup, our pride of Flaxborough, was discovered in the coal scuttle, its lining stained, its surface smeared not only with soot but with ink. He paused deliberately. The mention of ink drew murmurs. Mrs. Dewlap whispered that she had seen no ink. Creek muttered that it meant nothing. But Purbright's calm voice pressed on. Ink, ladies and gentlemen, which tells us that this cup did not spend the evening solely upon its velvet cushion. It came into contact with papers, specifically with the very ledger that was brought to light. If you examine carefully, you will see faint impressions where the engraving pressed against fresh writing. Love, startled, leaned in to peer. Indeed, faint smudges marked the bottom edge of the cup. He whispered hoarsely, "So the ledger and the cup were together, sir." But why? Purbright replaced the trophy on the table with care. Because they were being moved together. Councillor Raxby, it seems, had placed his ledger within the box that carried the cup. The polish on his tie shows he handled it himself tonight. He meant to keep the two close. Why? Perhaps he feared that his secrets might be taken from him unless hidden within the symbol of the town's pride. Or perhaps he meant to display the cup with one hand while keeping power with the other. Either way, his possession of both explains much. The guests shifted uneasily. The mayor tugged at his chain. Teal wiped his brow. Pike muttered something about blackmail. Purbright let their agitation build before continuing. The note warned him not to flaunt the cup. The ledger revealed names and figures. Both threatened reputations, and both together were too heavy a burden for one man to flaunt without consequence. Mrs. Durdle cried suddenly. "But the lace, Inspector—" "It was mine. I cannot deny it. I tore it at the door, I admit. But I swear I had nothing to do with the councillor's death." Purbright inclined his head mildly. "I believe you, madam. Lace may tear in many innocent ways, but lies fray more tellingly than cloth." His eyes moved gently across the room until they settled, almost kindly, upon Alderman Teal. "Tell me, Alderman, how came your initials to appear so prominently in the ledger?" Teal blustered, his wig slipping askew. "Forgery. Raxby was a rogue. He invented figures to ensnare us." "Yet," Purbright said, "you were seen in earnest conversation with him before the speeches, though you denied it. And when the mayor's papers were examined, your name appeared again in letters hinting at obstruction. You feared exposure." Teal sank back, his face damp, but Purbright was not finished. His gaze shifted to Pike, who had been uncharacteristically vocal in urging searches. "And you, Mr. Pike, you confirmed details against others, yet gave none of your own. You pressed us toward pockets and purses, knowing the true evidence lay in soot and ink." The landlord stammered. "I wanted the truth, Inspector. I sought only to help." "Perhaps," Purbright said softly. "But it was you who stood nearest the buffet when the second cufflink was discovered. You who fetched drinks, you who moved quietly enough to slip near the side door. And it is upon your sleeve, Mr. Pike, that I now see the faintest mark of soot." The room gasped. Pike looked down at his jacket, brushing desperately, but the smear was plain. "Coal dust, Inspector. I carry logs for the fire at the inn. It proves nothing." Purbright's voice did not rise, but the silence that met it gave his words weight. "It proves you handled the cup after it was hidden. You carried it, perhaps with the ledger still inside, intending to conceal both until the night's noise covered your escape. But Raxby, catching you at the plinth, tried to stop you." He struggled, tearing a cuff-link, staining his tie and collapsing in the effort. Whether he was struck or his heart gave way under the strain may never be known. But the deceit, the concealment, that was yours. All eyes were fixed on the landlord. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, But no denial formed. Mrs. Dewlap hissed in triumph. Creek smirked with savage relief. Mrs. Durdle wept softly, half with relief that suspicion had passed. Pike sagged in his chair, the fight draining from him. "I never meant harm," he muttered hoarsely. "The cup was worth little, but the ledger, if that got out, the council would tear itself apart. I only meant to keep it quiet. Raxby caught me, and he fell. I panicked, hid the cup, fled back, said nothing." The mayor groaned, burying his face in his hands. Teal muttered prayers. The chamber, exhausted, seemed to collapse inward, its grandeur undone by the admission of shabby deceit. Purbright simply adjusted his spectacles. "Deception rarely intends murder, Mr. Pike. But once begun, it seldom chooses where to end." Sergeant Love closed his notebook with finality. The constables stepped forward, their heavy boots echoing. The landlord rose shakily, surrendering without resistance. The guests, though drained, seemed to swell with a mixture of vindication and relief. Flaxborough, bruised but not broken, had its culprit, or at least its explanation. Purbright remained by the plinth, his eyes upon the faint dust where the cup had once gleamed. He spoke almost to himself. "Respectability, Sergeant, is a fragile polish. Once scratched, it reveals what lies beneath. Councillor Raxby discovered the truth tonight. The rest of us are only slower in admitting it." Love shifted uneasily, then asked, "And the cup, sir?" "What becomes of it now?" Purbright allowed a faint smile. "It will be polished again, no doubt. Civic pride is stubborn, but every mark does not vanish, however much one rubs." The chamber fell silent, each person aware of the inspector's quiet verdict. Outside, the press still shouted questions, but within, the night's noise had ended. The truth, or at least enough of it, had been laid bare. And Flaxborough would wake to gossip, headlines, and scandal, as it always did. But in the stillness of the chamber, it was clear that the case of the Council Gala killing had found its shape.